impressive. Well, good morning, all. People are going to continue to come in, but we're very familiar with the traffic issues in our town these days, so we're going to get underway and have everyone out of here as we promised at 10:30 this morning. But we think we've got a great program, and for those of you who have not been to the Boston Foundation before, not been to our new space here on the third floor, I want to issue a particularly warm welcome and express the hope that you will be back here many, many times in the future. One of the roles we like to play, as you know, is performing and commissioning cutting-edge research that will help us define and act on the challenges and issues that we face as a community. And this work is made possible by the Civic Leadership Fund, which is an annual fund here at the Foundation, supported by more than 400 donors. And for those of you who do contribute to the Civic Leadership Fund, we're very grateful, and we'd love to ask those of you who have not done that to think about doing so. While we often partner with third parties to examine key issues in Boston, this report was completed by our in-house research center, the Boston Indicators Project, which we have had here at the Foundation for more than 20 years. And we have a long tradition of releasing a biennial report that focuses on a particularly important issue in our community. So in this tradition, we are releasing the next report focused on the topic of economic mobility, building on a 2015 Boston Indicators report, Shape of the City, issued during the Foundation's centennial. This report illuminated the issue of growing economic inequality in Boston. We are also informed by a growing body of national data and research about the economic divides and the fading American dream, and we're particularly fortunate that we're going to hear some of that national data and perspective a little later on in the program. The report finds that we are indeed, sadly, a full participant in some of the negative national trends that are going on. And these are very worrisome trends indeed, because they seem to be compromising the American dream and the opportunity for hard work to yield success that we prize as a society. And two dimensions of this, of course, are increasing income stratification and large gaps between the strata, and a decline in economic mobility. These two things in combination are deadly. Stratification is one thing. If you have significant mobility, though, that offers the hope for movement up the scale. If both are in decline, that's a very, very serious problem indeed. However, we will also hear that, at least relatively speaking, we have some advantages in attacking this problem, and we particularly want to focus on those because the aim, of course, is to do something about this, not merely observe it. To get us going, I want to introduce two of our featured speakers. First, you'll hear from Luke Schuster, who is the director of the Boston Indicators Project, who will present the findings of the report. And after Luke, we will hear from John Freedman, a founding co-director of the newly launched Economic Mobility Think Tank at Harvard. Opportunity Insights, formerly the Equality of Opportunity Project. John will pick up where Luke leaves off and share some of his team's work to bring new understanding to drivers of economic mobility in cities across the U.S. Please welcome Luke Schuster.
Thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks everybody for coming out. Just a couple more comments about the work of Boston Indicators. The groundwork that Paul just laid is really helpful to let me hit the ground running. A key theme throughout all of our work is to bring an equity lens, and this research, I think, follows nicely in that tradition. We want to make sure that Boston's delivering for all residents across neighborhood, across race, gender, sexual orientation, and I hope you see throughout this report all the ways in which the city's really thriving in the aggregate, but falling short at delivering on our promise to provide for everybody in a more robust way. One comment about what this report is and a bit about what it isn't. I really view this as a sort of foundation-laying piece, describe where we are today, a lot of detail on how we got here. We end with some of our best thinking on local action areas for change, but I just want to stress up front that we don't view that as a perfect exhaustive list, but rather our contribution to the growing conversation about how we can build more broadly shared prosperity in the region. And I'm just really eager, once this report is released today, to then roll up our sleeves in the coming months and years and do more focused research on all the best ideas for building a more broadly shared economy moving forward. And I hope we get to do that in partnership with many of you in the room. Okay, so let's dive into the research. First, let's just look at some of the key indicators of Boston's economic boom, because this is the broad backdrop for a lot of the challenges that we'll go through. Our state economy is growing, and it's become more productive than the US economy overall. This is good news. Back in the late 1970s, our economy actually lagged the national economy on a per worker basis, but for the last couple of decades, we've become a stronger local economy. Unemployment's very low. The shape of this graph really mirrors the shape of the business cycle, but we can see we're 8-10 years into an economic recovery. Unemployment's low nationally, and it's even lower here in the Boston region. We have the most highly educated workforce in the country. Almost half of our workforce has a college degree or more. One thing that's translating into is higher wages. This looks at median household income in Massachusetts compared to the rest of the country, and we rank 6th highest in terms of median household income. Now, median household income is not a perfect measure for how well we're delivering. I think it's useful to look at the middle of the distribution. Later in this presentation, I'll show a lot of detail on how we're doing at the lower end of the distribution, but I think there's some good news here. And then finally, home values have skyrocketed, especially in Boston. If you look at the national trend line, you can see home values nationally just now recovered from the Great Recession. I was actually surprised when we pulled this data how tightly clustered Massachusetts, Greater Boston, and the city were up until the Great Recession. And look at that spike for the city over the last 8 or 10 years. In large part, I think this is good news. It means people want to live in the city. Home values are rising as a consequence. But obviously, there's some real troubling news related to this, which is 2/3 of the city is renters. So if you're a long-standing homeowner in the city, this is really good news. Your family's wealth has gone up over time. But for 2/3 of the city, this is largely translating into higher rents and making it tougher to make ends meet. So I think this transitions nicely then to the first set of key findings from the report, which is that Boston's middle class is hollowing out. Rising housing costs are a key part of that story, and I want to demonstrate it by just doing some basic math on answering the question, can middle-class renters realistically afford to live in Boston in 2018? So, median monthly rent for a typical unit currently listed on the market, $2,600 a month. Times 12, that's basically $31,000 a year. Let's compare that $31,000 to median household income within the city of Boston, which is $61,000 a year. So at the median, rent costs more than half of your income in a given year. In housing circles, there's this common benchmark that says if housing costs make up more than 30% of your income, you're considered housing cost burdened. So I think about this number in that context. At the median, households well above that benchmark in terms of housing cost burden in the city. And then one final way to look at this data is to say, what income would it take to be above that 30% threshold? $104,000 a year. The next slide is a screenshot of an interactive map that we've made available. It's actually live on our website now as part of this report online that does exactly this calculation, but for every census tract in the city. We know there's wide variation across neighborhood. It's a little hard to make out the numbers here, but what I've highlighted is just a sample census tract in Dorchester where we do this math specific to that neighborhood. And you can see that in almost no neighborhood in the city of Boston can a household earning at the median afford median rents according to that 30% threshold. In fact, no neighborhood in Dorchester, Roxbury, or Mattapan has rents that are affordable at that level. And real quickly, a big thank you to Peter Churchak on the Indicators team, who did a ton of work throughout this report, in particular on putting this interactive tool together. Thanks a lot for your help on this, Peter. So what does this mean in terms of the composition of our city over time? The next graph is going to compare the number of households in Boston who are low income, middle income, and upper income from 1990 to today. I think this graph really provides the picture of the hollowing out of our middle class. An increase of 30,000 low-income households, an increase of 43,000 high-income households, and then a decrease in the middle of 15,000. So even though our population has grown over the last 25 years, we've lost a significant number of middle-income families. There's a very similar story playing out in terms of the workforce in the state. The state projects occupation growth out to 2024. We analyzed those occupation projections and clustered them by income level, and you'll see a very similar shape of the story, where the state's projecting greater low-income job growth, greater high-income job growth, and lower middle-income job growth in the Boston region out to 2024. Now, it's not just changes in the housing market and in the labor market that are leading to this kind of income polarization and the declining middle class. It's also just a consequence of rising income inequality nationwide, which Paul mentioned in his opening comments. So the next couple slides are going to show some of that data and see how it's playing out here locally. So first, this is actually basically the same graph I showed at the very beginning of the presentation. It looks at economic productivity in Massachusetts, continuing to increase since the late 1970s. Good news here. But let's compare this economic growth with trends in median household income in Massachusetts back to 2000. We can see, except for small increases in 2015 and 2016, we've seen almost no meaningful income growth at the middle of the distribution, even though the economy has continued to grow. This is really part of a broad national story. In the immediate post-World War II era, as the economy was growing, wages throughout the distribution grew right in line with that economic productivity. But something changed in the early 1970s. The decline of labor unions, especially in the private sector, have led workers to have less bargaining power. Big changes in international trade, market consolidation, meaning that there are fewer businesses competing within a given market, making it harder for workers to compete for higher wages. The Upshot in the New York Times earlier this year did a really interesting piece that I think personalizes this in a useful way, which was to compare the experience of two janitors at top tech firms of their time. So the first janitor was someone who worked at Kodak back in the early 1980s in Rochester, New York. And the second janitor is someone currently working for Apple in Cupertino, California. And while they actually make somewhat similar hourly wages, that's kind of where the similarities end. One big difference is the worker at Apple is actually not an employee of Apple. That janitor works for a company that's outsourced. And part of what that means is that worker doesn't get earned paid sick time or vacation benefits, no tuition reimbursement. The worker at Kodak, on the other hand, got on-the-job training, and over the course of her career moved up from being a janitor to becoming a mid-level manager and really living a middle-class existence. So I thought that was just an interesting story about how these trends are really playing out on the ground. So this graph looked at trends in the middle of the distribution in Massachusetts. Next, let's look at income changes across the distribution from the late 1970s to today. So on the left-hand side of the graph from your perspective, we see almost no wage gains. At the 10th percentile, that's the lowest end of the spectrum. Modest gains at the middle, and it's not till the very top that you see meaningful income gains. And in fact, this picture would be even more stark if we included income from business and other types of investments. This just looks at ordinary wage income. So finally, let's look at income disparities by race in Boston. I'm going to show median household income by race, first just within the city. You can see white households earning basically double what households of color are earning in Boston. Let's do the same thing, but for Metro Boston. Very similar story on the right-hand side of the graph. Striking difference within the Asian community in particular. Asians in Metro Boston earn more than twice as much as Asian households do in the city of Boston. I think this just shows what a diverse, broad category, the sort of racial category of Asian is. We're actually early in the process of doing a research project with several researchers at UMass looking at these trends across race and income within the metro region. So look forward to diving more into some of these trends. But we see very clear disparities across race as well. Next, let's look at poverty. I think we can all agree that sort of regardless of trends at the middle and at the top of the distribution, we are wealthy enough as a community that we ought to be able to provide an adequate baseline standard of living. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. Still 1 in 10 residents in Massachusetts lives in poverty. It's good that we have a poverty rate lower than the national rate. We've seen some improvements in recent years, but I want to highlight one, I think, especially troubling piece here, which is that both the US and the Massachusetts poverty rates are still above what they were for their pre-recession level. So we've seen some improvement in recent years, but we're still not back to that pre-recession level. Another thing to note about this graph is this is using the official federal poverty measure, which is a very crude, low benchmark. Under the Obama administration, there was a recognition that this measure is really crude, and they undertook the exercise of designing a more nuanced poverty measure. It's called the supplemental poverty measure, and the Census Bureau continues to update that and publish data at the state level. So the next slide is going to show that data for Massachusetts compared to the rest of the country. And we can see we're in the middle of the pack according to the supplemental poverty measure. The kind of adjustment it makes is by capturing regional differences in cost of living, so it reflects the fact that it takes more to make ends meet here in Boston. So even though we have relatively high wages, we have a very strong local economy, we have a poverty rate that's higher than 29 other states in the country. The final two sections of this presentation are going to look at longer trends of economic outcomes. First, we'll look at wealth, and then second, we'll look at economic mobility. A lot of local research like this on similar issues often doesn't include analyses of wealth. I think that's probably for a couple reasons. One is just there isn't very good local data on net assets. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, many of you probably saw in 2015, did a landmark survey of net assets by wealth and race in the Boston area, which helped add to the local body of knowledge. But I also think one reason why we don't focus as much here is it's just such a long-term measure. It gets at these big, sticky issues of cross-generational transfers of wealth, and it's just hard to move the needle on it. As we were working on this report, I heard an interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's one of the leading thinkers on race in America. And he was asked the question, out into the future, what would be a signal to you that we as a society have overcome our issues of race injustice? And without hesitating, he said, the racial wealth gap would be 0. And that really stuck with me, that wealth is a sort of trailing, lagging indicator, and it's really the sum total of all of the decisions we make as a society. And we really ought to keep our eye on this measure in terms of thinking about how equitable we really are. So what's the data look like? Here's national data on net assets by race back to the early 1960s. We see a gap in the early 1960s that's growing to today. Unfortunately, the survey this is based on doesn't have a large enough sample size to report outcomes for Asians, so that's why we have just 3 categories here. We wanted to add to this body of understanding locally by looking just at home ownership. Obviously, a family's home is often their single most valuable asset. So first, we just looked at home ownership rates by race, and we found not very surprising results, which is that white households owned homes at higher rates. And we thought maybe that's just because white households have higher incomes, as we saw a couple slides ago. So we wanted to take the analysis a step further, which was to control by income and just compare households of similar income and look at home ownership rates by race. So the first graph I'll show next is exactly that for middle-income households in Greater Boston. And we see over 2/3 of middle-income households in our region white households own a home, and just about 50% of Black, Asian, and Hispanic or Latino households are able to own homes. Next, and I think maybe even more striking, is the same analysis but for low-income households. Still, more than 1/3 of low-income white households in our region are able to own homes. How is that possible? I think one thing that might be happening is just an issue of time. When the survey is done, a household might own a home but then be out of work at the time the survey is asked. That would be an issue across all of these racial categories. I think far more likely is just the long cross-generational effect of wealth transfers and the set of public policy decisions we made as a society to prop wealth building, especially among white communities. Share just a brief personal story. All 4 of my grandparents were raised extremely working class. They grew up in the sort of World War II generation, and they were the beneficiaries of a couple of key policy decisions to support asset building. One grandfather was the beneficiary of very generous GI benefits as a veteran of World War II, helped my father go to college. And then both sides of the family benefited from Federal Housing Administration loans, which were very explicitly not made available, especially in urban areas, to communities of color, and especially Black households. So my parents inherited some moderate home wealth when their parents passed away. And then when my father passed away 10 years ago, my sister and I inherited some modest wealth from him. And that's made a huge difference across generations in our family, and I think really speaks to the kind of policy decisions we need to make moving forward to support asset building in all communities. So finally, let's look at another long-term measure of economic well-being, which is economic mobility. And again, a really special thank you to John Freedman and Opportunity Insights. They've done just groundbreaking national work on the issue of declining economic mobility across generations in the United States. And a really unique thing that they've done on the heels of that national research is to share their back-end data with local researchers like us to develop better local understanding about how these issues are playing out. And so all of the data in here is based on the research that they've done. So I've just so appreciated this partnership, and I hope this section provides a nice transition to John's presentation in a minute. So what's the trend in Massachusetts first? We're going to look at a measure that looks at the share of a given birth cohort that earns more than their parents by the time they're working age adults. So it compares the inflation-adjusted incomes of a kid at 30 with their parents when they were 30. 91% of people born in Massachusetts in 1940 ended up earning more than their parents by the time they were a working adult. I think this is one way to think of the American dream largely being realized, rising living standards being shared broadly over time. But look at how much this has changed in the intervening decades. Someone born in Massachusetts in 1980 had only a 55% chance of out-earning their parents in 2010 by the time they were 30 years old. Now, this picture is very similar with the nationwide data. In fact, many states saw even sharper declines than here in Massachusetts. The next slide is going to focus in on Boston. This data in this slide is from a work they released a couple of years ago. Earlier this year, Opportunity Insights released a new report called Two Americas, which uses a slightly different measure of economic mobility. It looks at low-income kids at the 25th percentile of the distribution and tracks where they land as working-age adults. So let's compare how Boston ranks on that measure to the 100 largest cities in the United States. And here's some of the positive news that Paul was flagging. Within this broader context of mobility going down everywhere, Boston actually ranks high relative to other cities, second highest in the country, tied with Minneapolis. So I think there's something we're doing well to help, at least in this relative ranking, lead us near the top. The data also allows us to break out by race, which I'll do in the next slide. There's a lot going on in these few slides, by the way, so I just want to flag that the economic mobility section of the print report, which we have in the back of the room, has a lot more of this detail. But I just want to flag the rankings across here, which is that Black households in Boston rank first compared to Black households in other U.S. cities on this measure of low-income mobility. White households and Hispanic households also in the top 10. Again, unfortunately, we don't have a large enough sample size in enough U.S. cities to report this data for Asians. Also just want to note comparisons across these categories, though. So even though whites rank a little bit lower than blacks in Boston, they're landing at a slightly higher dollar amount, $28,000 a year, compared to $25,000 a year for black Bostonians. When this work was released nationally, one of the key findings that got a lot of attention was when you disaggregate this data one further step and break out outcomes for race and gender. And the most troubling finding was especially low outcomes for black men in particular. This next pair of maps I'm going to show you will describe some of that data a little bit more. So let me walk you through this. On the left-hand map, we're plotting outcomes for low-income black men. The right-hand map is for white men on the same scale. And so I think the first thing you notice is there's basically no overlap in the colors on these two maps. The outcomes for low-income black males are lower than almost all of the outcomes for low-income white males. And Boston's an interesting part of this story. So we can see Boston has a higher income level than the other cities we flag here at $24,000 a year. But compare that to Atlanta. Atlanta's one of the major US cities with the lowest outcomes for low-income white men, and they're still landing at a place in the distribution that's $2,000 a year higher than the outcomes for black men in Massachusetts. This can be tough to wrap your heads around because you're sort of having to hold two things at once. I want to describe one factor that I think helps explain how these might be true, which is to talk for a second about incarceration rates. Higher incarceration rates are associated with lower economic mobility, and that's probably not surprising. When you take someone out of the community, you take them out of their job. We are doing a terrible job at providing education and training for folks who are in prison. We don't do nearly enough to smooth the transition back into society. So we wanted to look at how Massachusetts compared on incarceration rates to the rest of the country, and we actually rank quite well. We have very low in incarceration rates compared to the rest of the country, and in fact, that actually holds when you look just specifically for black men, which I'll do in this next graph. So this looks at state imprisonment rates for black men, and you see Massachusetts has the second lowest imprisonment rates for black men in the country. A quick aside, if we did this comparison internationally, it would be a very different story. Our imprisonment rates are still very high by international standards. But I think this helps explain one reason why we might have slightly higher mobility for black men than elsewhere. But let's put this in broader context by doing the same comparison to imprisonment rates for white men. So even though we have low imprisonment rates for black men compared to black men, our black male imprisonment rate is higher than the imprisonment rate for white males in every other state in the country, including Massachusetts. Massachusetts actually has the lowest imprisonment rate for white men at 81 per 100,000. But I think this helps explain how both of these stories can be true at the same time. Okay, let me end by just sharing some of our current thinking on local action areas for building more broadly shared prosperity. The report focuses on local action areas because we're here in Boston and this is kind of our area of work. I do think it's really important to stress up front how important the federal policy conversation is as well. There's big sort of national economic headwinds that we're facing here locally, and we need to also contribute to those policy debates at the same time. Our US Senator Elizabeth Warren earlier this month released a really ambitious plan to restructure corporate boards to ensure greater worker voice on corporate boards to help balance the responsibility to shareholders with that of workers and also customers and the broader community in which they operate. I share that example not to say that that's exactly the legislation we need to pass, but just to say that that strikes me as the kind of policy debate we need to be having at the national level to address these broader trends. So what are the things that came top to mind for us through the course of our work for acting locally? Obviously, continuing to reduce incarceration rates and to reform our criminal justice system more broadly. Reduce housing costs. There's just no question that sort of rising housing costs are kind of eating all of our lunch right now. Expand labor force protections. This is one area where we've made real progress recently. Voters passed earned paid sick time recently. We have a relatively high state minimum wage. But there's more areas to consider action, like predictable scheduling for part-time workers. Fix the jobs housing mismatch and improve our transportation system. Admittedly, this report's pretty weak on issues around transportation, but there's no question there's a real close connection between our crumbling transportation infrastructure and our housing issues in the whole region. We need to improve the quality and the affordability of our education system, especially pressing issues in terms of the cost of early ed and higher ed. We need to eliminate racial bias. There's a whole host of ways in which just interpersonal race bias and race prejudice harms opportunities and outcomes for especially communities of color. Reduce residential segregation. We live in a region that has very real residential segregation, and when neighborhoods are segregated, resources often follow, and there's very disparate access to things like high-quality schools and high-quality infrastructure. We need to support the creation of good jobs and provide workforce training ladders for those without bachelor's degrees. It's great that almost half of our workforce has a college degree or more, but that means more than half of our workforce doesn't have a college degree. And we need to make sure that there are good jobs available for those folks and workforce training ladders so that folks have the opportunity to move up over the course of their careers. We need to support the establishment of strong social capital. There's a really compelling growing body of research on how important social ties are, both within the family and the broader community, in terms of supporting long-term opportunities and chances. And that's exactly why we've got Jesus Garenia on the panel coming up from Family Independence Initiative working on exactly this set of issues. We need to provide affordable, accessible, high-quality health care. Again, this is an area where Massachusetts has been a leader. We provided universal health care to low-income residents ahead of the nation, but there's a whole lot more we can do to ensure that we're providing quality health care that's not busting the budget. And then finally, welcome new immigrants and provide supports to integrate them into our neighborhoods, schools, and our local economy. There's a raging debate nationally around the role of immigrants in our society. And I just think, at least in the economic literature, there's just no question that immigrants actually help boost local economies. And that's almost certainly been part of the story of Boston's renaissance over the last few decades, is us welcoming a greater share of new immigrants. So, that's a lot of material. Thanks for bearing with me. I just want to end with one final note, which is there are a lot of places in this country where economic mobility is down, income inequality is up, but the economy stinks. And that's not the case here. We are really operating from a position of strength. And I think that doesn't mean it's automatic that we're going to solve all these problems, but I think we're really fortunate to be functioning within a thriving broader economy, and that really provides us great opportunities to tackle these challenges more quickly than in other parts of the country. So thanks a lot, and with that I'll introduce John Freedman.
Well, thank you, Luke. That was really a tour de force in presenting a ton of information on how Massachusetts and Boston sits in the national environment. And I agree with a lot of what he said, especially the graphs that were ours. So I think this is a really nice transition, as Luke said, because the starting point for this current work that we're doing, really diving into local neighborhoods, is exactly some of the statistics that Luke cited. And just to start, the Opportunity Insights is a new research and policy think tank at Harvard. And I think what is really new about what we're doing is that we're really trying to move beyond focusing solely on the research to partnering with great groups like the Boston Foundation to think about how these statistics can be useful in communities across the country. And so it's so wonderful to be here this morning with Boston Foundation, with the Boston Indicators, with all of you, at the beginning of what I hope is a long and fruitful partnership for us to think about these issues in detail here in Boston, where we're located. Now, as Luke said, our approach is to use big data to essentially study the evolution of the American dream and analyze really whatever seems like it's working from childhood to adulthood. And the culmination of our recent efforts has been a data product that we call Opportunity Atlas, which is a collaboration with the census. And what that provides is maps like this, similar to what Luke showed you, where we can study upward mobility and economic opportunity for children of all different types throughout the country. So can we switch the, perfect. So this is all on the web, and so it's at opportunityinsights.org and opportunityatlas.org if you're interested in exploring yourself. But just to start here, you see this map of the country that Luke pointed out, and there are great regional differences in opportunity for children from low-income families. So Boston is up here. We are among the better cities in the nation in terms of opportunity for children of different races, as Luke mentioned. Now, what motivated us to really take the next step? Well, looking at a map like this, you can say, well, here, low-income children from in the Boston area earn on average $37,000 when they grow up. And so these are kids who grow up in families that have about $25,000 worth of annual income, and they grew up in the 80s and 90s, and they're now in their mid-30s today. So if we're interested in understanding what we can do to make that even better, right, one thing you can do is you can go to the middle of the country, and you can say, well, here's Dubuque, Iowa. Dubuque, Iowa has average incomes for children from similarly poor families of $46,000. But just saying, well, let's go try to be more like Dubuque, that doesn't seem so helpful. There's so many differences between what's going on in Boston and what's going on in Dubuque that it just, I mean, maybe there's something we can learn, but that doesn't seem like the right way to make comparisons in a way that's going to be policy relevant and useful. And so what instead we did is we built this data app where we can really zoom into the Boston area and not just understand opportunity on average in Boston, but understand how opportunity varies on this map here, literally from neighborhood to neighborhood within the city. And what you see on this map for the Boston city and for the Boston area is actually very similar to what you see in cities across the country. That is, you see essentially the same full range of outcomes across neighborhoods within a given city as you see nationally, right? And the colors on this map are meaning the same thing on this local map as it did on the national map, right? So we have the entire range of variation from kind of quite red areas where we have outcomes in parts of our city that look like Atlanta to areas of blue where we have outcomes that are in fact even higher than Dubuque. We have that full range right here in the city of Boston and in the Boston area more generally. And we think that this is a much better starting point because if we can look inside our city and understand not just how we stack up against other cities nationally, but what specific neighborhoods in the city seem to provide opportunity for children and what neighborhoods don't, that seems like a much better starting point for comparison. We can understand what are the things that are going right in those neighborhoods that provide opportunity, what are the things that maybe aren't going right in the neighborhoods that fail to provide opportunity, and what can we do from a policy perspective in order to make those latter set of neighborhoods look more like the former. So a couple more things I want to demonstrate on this atlas before kind of returning to talk about more of these broader themes. Obviously, looking at this map, you see that these red areas are clustered in neighborhoods with a large non-white population. And so, for the same reasons that Luke mentioned nationally, it's very important to kind of think about this as kind of understanding the geography of opportunity differently for children of different races. That's a function we can do on this atlas. So here we can focus in to look on only at the outcomes of black children. And we're now recoloring the map to compare black children's outcomes in any given neighborhood to be compared to the outcomes of low-income black children nationally, right? So if we were to compare them to everyone, this is the point Luke made before, basically it would just, it would all be red. And the fact that, in Boston we have neighborhoods that are not deep red is actually a sign, like that's how you know that Boston is one of the best in the country for black children. But so just for the sake of having contrast, I'm going to go back here. You see that there are a lot of areas on the map that are gray and have no color. That's because it's the segregated nature of Boston and many other cities. There simply are not enough black children growing up in many of these neighborhoods in order to even produce an estimate, right? So that's why we only see estimates in some parts of the city. Now, again, even for black children in Boston, you see great variation, right? So for instance, if we look in some of these neighborhoods up around Roxbury Crossing, outcomes of about $23,000. Again, these is for black children growing up in families earning about $25,000 a year, right? So this is like worse than many parts of the Southeast. Down here in Savin Hill, we see outcomes of $39,000. This is one of the best neighborhoods in the country for low-income black children, starting to earn incomes that would actually start to be comparable to many of the better neighborhoods for white children in Boston and elsewhere. And so again, there's just this tremendous variation, often in neighborhoods that are only a few miles apart. And so I think this really, again, we see this in Boston, we see this in other cities nationally, and so this is not a unique pattern. I think it really orients one's focus towards really local policy efforts, exactly because these things differ so much, right? It's not just that these patterns are specific in Boston, but even the neighborhoods that do well or don't do well, there's no reason to expect that the reasons that neighborhoods fail in Boston are the same reasons that neighborhoods fail in Newark or in Houston or in San Francisco. Like each city is going to have its own special thing going on, and so that's why it's so important to have dedicated local groups like the Boston Foundation and all of you thinking about how we can make progress on these issues. So one more thing to show you here. Luke mentioned that things look quite different for men and for women. And in Boston, what we see is that essentially all of these existing differentials just get magnified for men relative to women, especially who are black. And so I think that what these data do is offer the opportunity to really think in a targeted way, not just about opportunity generally, but about each neighborhood, each type of demographic group, not necessarily broken down on racial grounds, but really thinking in detail about how we can design policies to target specifically what are the needs of different communities, and I'll come back to that at the end of my talk to talk about that a little bit more generally. Can we flip back to the slides, please? Great. So, what can we, taking a step back, what are important things to think about as we interpret these opportunity measures in the city of Boston and nationally? Well, the first thing to ask, I think, is, why is it that these mobility measures vary across neighborhoods, right? We know there are very different communities living in different parts of the city, and it's possible that this just reflects something about the people who live there rather than anything about the neighborhood per se. And so this is, I think, a very important thing, because if it were all about the people who lived there, then you wouldn't necessarily have this focus on neighborhoods per se. You just focus on people, and they would live wherever they live, and that's all right. That's not the case. And so we can demonstrate this by showing that children's opportunities are strongly affected by the neighborhood in which they grow up, in the literal sense that if children move from one neighborhood to another, they see very different potential outcomes. So in order to demonstrate this, let me kind of have you think about a hypothetical of a child who moves from Roxbury Crossing to Savin Hill at some age. And so just to start, think about children who are very, very young who move from Roxbury Crossing to Savin Hill. These dashed lines represent just the kind of the raw average outcomes, as I showed you on the map before. Children who move from Roxbury Crossing to Savin Hill, when they are 2, have average earnings when they get into their 30s of about $38,000. That is, they almost look like the average for Savin Hill. And I think that's intuitive because they've now spent most of their life living in Savin Hill. We can repeat this experiment as children get older and older, and what we see is that the older you are when you move, the more you look like the children who spend all their time in Roxbury Crossing. And that is, it's really about exposure to these different neighborhoods. The earlier you move to a better neighborhood, the better off you're going to do. And then it kind of tails off around age 22, 23. So that if we look at kids who move after that, we see this is really not that much effect. And this highlights the importance of childhood and young adulthood as the times when neighborhoods have, or at least seem to have the greatest impact on these children. And I think that's really helpful for orienting policy, like kind of these are the ages where at least neighborhood-based policies seem to have the greatest impact. So this tells us that neighborhoods do impact children's outcomes, so it is useful to think about this in a place-based way. I think then the next question you might want to ask is, what are the features of high mobility neighborhoods, right? So this is not necessarily causal things about policies, but we can just describe what high opportunity neighborhoods look like. And I think there are 3 characteristics that stand out in the data nationally. The first thing is it is about the people. Not literally in that, your opportunity follows you wherever you go, but the people in the community seem to correlate very strongly with kids' outcomes. In that places with lower poverty rates, higher employment rates, and higher education rates are all places that tend to have higher opportunity and higher outcomes for kids. Now, I think the important thing here is it's about the people, not the economy. And so you see this both at the local level and at the national kind of city level. Very similar circumstances to we see in Boston, where there are cities with thriving economies, booming job growth numbers, but ones where children who grew up in that city have not had access to great opportunities. Now Boston, and I think we do pretty well on this measure, we kind of both have relatively high opportunity and also a booming economy. But again, if you want a counterexample, think about places like Atlanta or Charlotte, which have been just incredibly booming economies over the last several decades. In the case especially of Atlanta, there's a thriving black middle class, a lot of great jobs. The problem is they're just not being filled by the children who grew up there. And so what's happening is that a lot of those jobs are being created and individuals are moving into the community to take them. Again, that's not saying that economic growth is a bad thing. It's a great thing for many reasons. We just shouldn't confuse that with being the same thing as providing opportunity and setting children, especially from poor families or minority families, on the right trajectory. Second, there are factors about the community. In particular here, I'm thinking about more social capital, and also communities in which there are more 2-parent families are strongly better for children in terms of their outcomes. And again, what's really interesting here, just to take the 2-parent families as an example, we all think about the direct impact where a child may be better off if they themselves live in a 2-parent family, and that is true. But what is in fact a better correlate, what is more predictive of opportunity, is the fraction of other 2-parent families in the community. Right? It's really about the other families, what I've referred to in the previous, the fabric of the community. That turns out to be really important. That's a very difficult thing to operate on from a policy perspective, but I think it's a great challenge that we all need to step up to. Third, we see a key correlation with schools. Higher test scores for children correlates strongly with opportunity. I don't want to overstress this, though, because we see a tremendous amount of difference in outcomes for children living not just in the same school district, but in the same school catchment zone. Children attending the same high school have very, very different outcomes. And so to kind of even flesh this out further, we can think about, how granular can this get? And it turns out that we really want to think in a very, very local way, almost in literally a block-to-block sense rather than even a neighborhood-to-neighborhood sense. All of these attributes describe neighborhoods that have high opportunity for children. But what's very important to note is that even taking all of these things into account, you can still only predict about half of the variation across neighborhoods. That is, by actually following children through to adulthood, these measures pick up roughly twice the variation in outcomes that you would guess just by using the traditional measures. And so, we don't think that these outcome-based measures should replace traditional measures, but it's not just a way to reshape them. It's not just a summary statistic for these traditional measures like the poverty rate and the crime rate and education rate. There's a ton of stuff that goes beyond that, and so I think we really want to start by looking at these measures in order to understand how neighborhoods are functioning. Now, given that we see so much variation in opportunity that we cannot explain by obvious things about neighborhoods, another way of saying that is that similar looking neighborhoods, in fact, provide very different opportunity for children. And one way in which this is particularly true is thinking about the cost of living in these neighborhoods. It's intuitive to think that families who want a better neighborhood are going to have to pay more in rent, are going to have to move to a more expensive part of town. On average, this is true. So I've plotted the median 2-bedroom rent. This is in numbers are a little bit lower than Luke had because this is just coming from 2010, but I think the picture is more or less the same with the measure of these long-term outcomes. What you see is that it is true that on average, more expensive neighborhoods provide better opportunity for children, but the relationship is far from one for one. What in fact we see is that there are many pairs of neighborhoods, like the neighborhoods of Savin Hill and Roxbury Crossing that I was mentioning, that in fact provide dramatically different opportunities for children despite being relatively similarly priced. And we can, you can do this on many other dimensions too. It's pretty easy to find what we've called sister neighborhoods, where two neighborhoods that look very similar on a lot of dimensions, one providing great deals of opportunity and the other not. And we think that that type of analysis is a great way to get a foothold into what are these things that we're not seeing that seem to be driving opportunity and are very important. One final thing that I think we can help answer in these data is the question of what is a neighborhood anyway, right? We've analyzed this in the same way that Luke did based on census tracts, not because we thought hard about what a neighborhood should be and decided that census tract was the the ideal measure, but rather that's kind of the level at which the data come. But we can actually go in a more narrow way than that using the detailed individual data. And so just as a way of showing you this, what I've done is I want you to think about a child growing up on a given block. And I want to think about different kind of hypothetical experiments where we lower the poverty rate at different locations relative to them, and we kind of see what would happen from a predictive perspective. So as I said earlier, if you lower the poverty rate right where a child is living, that's going to be a good thing. That is, or to put it, a higher poverty rate would lower opportunity for kids. Now, let's think about what if you did that instead of literally on the block where the child is growing up. Suppose you did it 100 yards away. What impact would that have? Well, that's this next dot. It would only have about half the impact. What if you did it another set of blocks away, more like a quarter mile away? That's this next dot here. And what you see is you kind of continue to do this as you go away, improving the poverty rate, lowering the poverty rate in further parts away. Once you get about a half a mile, certainly a mile away, there's in fact no impact at all. And so again, that just highlights again the incredibly local nature of these forces that are so powerfully acting upon children and their trajectories. You really need to think about things not even at a city level, but really at a very detailed local neighborhood level, figure out what's going right or what's going wrong on each block. So just to finish up, let me kind of take a step back from the data and think about how would you use these data to actually try to make a difference. Well, we think there's kind of a 3-part process, which is very much analogous to what the medical community describes as precision medicine. Now, the idea there is that first you can diagnose a patient, in this case, to figure out not just generally what's going wrong, but really in specific detail what is exactly going wrong in this particular patient. Then there's a treatment phase, an evaluation phase, and then repeat that and hopefully the patient gets better. Here, we can think about applying this to neighborhoods. And so I think that in the first stage, what these data can help with is providing a diagnosis of what's going on that is much more detailed and granular than we've ever been able to do before. We can ask what are the places in greatest need. We can ask what policy approaches might be effective. And we can ask even when in a child's life do disparities arise as a way of helping pinpoint where we think policy intervention is necessary. So for instance, if we see in one neighborhood in the city where things aren't going so well, that children are arriving in kindergarten not prepared, then that's going to suggest that you really need to start targeting those early ages. In other neighborhoods, we might see children are actually doing okay and say their 8th grade test scores are actually not so bad, but there's really a fall off between that and college attendance or high school graduation rates. That suggests a different form of intervention in that neighborhood. And so these data can help you understand what's going on, not just in some general way, not just in saying that economic growth is not equally shared, but exactly how and why that's true. And then I think, how moving forward, it's incredibly important to work with local stakeholders on these interventions because, to be totally honest, I grew up in Boston, but the collective understanding of neighborhoods in this room is 100 times greater than any researcher would ever have. And so it's important to make sure that in combination with these data, we are understanding what's going on at a human level in each neighborhood. I think it's then very important to have this cycle repeat by evaluating the impact of whatever you've done, disseminate the lessons, and then coming back to the starting point in order to figure out what's working, what's not working from a policy perspective, and repeat the process all over again. So taking a step back, I think that these data in particular and big data more generally provide really a new paradigm for understanding and improving economic opportunity. The challenge of increasing mobility requires local action. And we can use big data to diagnose barriers in each area so that we're providing local solutions to local problems. It's not some one-size-fits-all national thing. We can prescribe these treatments when these diagnoses differ so much by place through working with cities and schools and other community partners in order to really design customized solutions. And I think that more broadly, this is again a social science analog of precision medicine to overcome what has been too much of a one-size-fits-all paradigm. So kind of just in closing, let me return to this data that Luke showed. This is, I think, one of the preeminent challenges of our generation to understand why this is happening. Why has the American dream been fading in this way? And understand what we can do to reverse it and provide more broadly shared growth and opportunity for all children. So again, thank you so much. I look forward to hearing what all of you have in response to all of these data. I look forward to hearing what the panelists have to say, and thank you so much.
Okay. Folks, thank you for being here. I want to extend my deep gratitude to both Luke and John for this really compelling data. While on the broad thematic level, I think we'd all agree that many of these findings are not surprising. What's really compelling to me in just listening to their presentations today is how important it is to add that nuance, to contextualize the data. And I love this analogy of getting down to the block level. If we don't really translate this data really down almost to that household level and really understand the lived experience behind these numbers, well, that's the big opportunity for us to design the kind of enduring solutions that we need to solve these issues, vexing issues. My name is Stephen Chan, and I'm Vice President for Strategy and Operations here at the Foundation. And I have the great pleasure of working with both Boston Indicators and the Forums and Events team that produced today's event, and I'm happy to be serving as moderator for this next section. We're going to spend about the next hour or so translating the data that we've just heard into insight and action, and we're going to do that with the help of some distinguished panelists, experts and practitioners that you'll hear from in just a moment that we've recruited to the cause. But before I bring them up on stage and we turn our attention to the front of the room, I'd like us to turn our attention inward. And I want to do that through a short exercise. And I'll kick this off by sharing a personal story. As I was preparing for today's forum and looking at all the data and thinking about the importance of place and all these other factors, policies, structural issues, I couldn't help but think about my own family's mobility story. Well, I grew up in a rosy suburb in San Diego. Yes, I grew up in San Diego. I'm here in Boston. My parents grew up in a flat in Hong Kong. And I thought back even further. I thought back to my grandparents who grew up in China in the early 1900s and were raising a family during the rise of communist China, and a decision that they were forced to make. An urgent decision to flee to Hong Kong in the late 1950s ahead of the Cultural Revolution, when border movements were increasingly restricted by the government. I thought about a story told by my parents about my grandfather's boss, without which my family would not have secured the necessary migration papers that sponsored their move. Without him and the life opportunities provided by a new home for my parents, and then my parents' subsequent immigration to America in the 60s, I know that my story would be very different. So as I was thinking about that, yes, in short, of course, place does matter. Social capital and who you know does matter. They were game changers for my family. So it made me curious. What can we each learn from a very brief examination of our own personal mobility stories? Each of us have lived experience, either ourselves or in our family's history, that are clues and puzzle pieces to what it takes to make it in Boston and to really make it in America, this American dream. So what I'd like to do is for us to take the next few minutes to tap on each of our own inner mobility experts. In a moment, we're going to turn to a partner, our neighbor. So identify your neighbor, say hello. And we're going to take a couple minutes each. Hello, great. That was great, everyone. And I'm going to ask you to do, this is how the exercise will go. Think to something that was discussed in the presentations today, a piece of data, a finding, a factor that Luke and John laid out. And identify one mobility game changer for you or for your family's story. And share that story with your partner and discuss with them how that reflection should inform our conversation today. And you only have 2 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the timer, and then I will tell you when you should switch, and then we'll close and I'll invite up our panelists, okay? Okay, begin. Okay, everyone. Okay, everyone. 2 minutes. Please switch. Okay, everyone. 2 minutes. Please switch. on here. Okay, everyone. Okay, everyone. Can you? Okay. That was great, everyone. We're going to resume the session. Okay. I think we got some great mobility stories going, so hope to hear those a little bit later in our Q&A. I'm going to take a seat here, and what I'd like to do right now is to invite up our panel and to briefly introduce them. You have extensive biographies on our distinguished panelists on your seats, so I'm not going to go and read every word, but I do want to give some context about why we are so thrilled to have this collection of wisdom and experience with us today to begin to unpack the data. First, I'm going to start to my left to introduce Megan Irons.
Hello.
Megan Irons of the Boston Globe. She's been a reporter there for 16 years,
Yep.
more than 16 years, including most recently serving as City Hall Bureau Chief. She currently covers social justice and race, highlighting equity, inequality, and cultural issues. And not in her bio, but I remember this. Some of us may also remember, Megan was a member of the Globe team that produced the award-winning 68 Blocks, a series of stories about life in the Bowdoin, Geneva neighborhood. To Megan's left is Jesus Guerrena, who is the CEO of Family Independence Initiative, or FII, which is a national organization with sites and partnerships in Boston and 11 other cities across the US. FII trusts and invests in low-income families across the nation so they can work individually and collectively to achieve prosperity. Jesus joined FII in 2010 as the executive director in Boston, and previously was deputy director at Hyde Square Task Force. And to Jesus's left is Janelle Chan, who is the Undersecretary of Housing and Community Development for the Commonwealth, a $1.2 billion agency which, among many, many things, as Janelle and I were speaking about, delivers services to homeless families, funds affordable housing development, and provides financial assistance to Massachusetts residents, municipalities, and communities. Prior to her appointment, Janelle was the chief of real estate for the MBTA and the executive director of Asian Community Development Corporation. Please join me in welcoming our panel. So let's get right to the exercise we just all went through. Very curious to hear what you shared with your mobility expert partner and what your inner mobility expert tells us we can learn from the data we just saw today. Anyone can start.
Oh, wow. They're just looking at me.
There we go.
I'm happy
I
to
will
go.
start.
Oh, okay, go for it.
I was sharing the fact that what worked for us in my family was housing. And I was born in Jamaica. My mom is from Jamaica. She came here when we were all very young, and we lived in one of those troubled neighborhoods in Dorchester. And she worked and saved, and with 4 children, and was able to purchase a home eventually. We did the the track that most immigrants do, and when they come to Boston, they start out in a very poor community. They get a bigger apartment in Mattapan, which we did, and then they eventually buy a house in Hyde Park, which we did. So that's what worked for us, and that's one of the things that spoke to me, along with some other stuff we'll talk about, in sort of looking at this data, is when you are able to create something for your kids, something they can take with them, that could increase their ability to earn a living or own a home or provide for their own children, that's really something. And then too often, that's not the case. Too often, folks here cannot afford to purchase a home. They can't even afford to rent. So that was what I shared to Josh Freedman.
So my story, two things I felt were important. One is, so I grew up in Puerto Rico, similar immigrant story, and moved to Amherst, Massachusetts, and that was everything for us, right? And I learned that when I started working in the nonprofit sector in Holyoke, Massachusetts, when I understood I was a victim of a zip code. And that if we would have landed anywhere else, right, our path would have been much different. And it gave my mom the opportunity to be able to pursue education, as well as a post-grad degree, purchase a home, and put us on a path. And then the second thing that, because we didn't have great wealth, it wasn't like she could help us in purchasing a home. So I got a NACA loan here in Boston to be able to purchase a home in 2014. And very low interest, and as well as very little down, and that access, right, to be able to have that loan product for that stabilizing housing was really critical in being able to put a foot forward and building wealth for my family now.
Thank you.
Stephen's story and I are slightly different. Although we are both Chinese American, grew up in California, went to school in Cambridge, even have the same last name. I think the similarities end there. As I reflect on my own story, education was a key component of that. And my parents, they never graduated middle school. And for me to come out here, that is intergenerational mobility that is illustrated there. However, one interesting thing is about that wealth generation, and place really does matter. Because a 1,200 square foot home that my parents raised me in happens to be in Silicon Valley. So that 1,200 square foot home that was under $100,000 is now worth $1 million. And so within their generation, they were able to find stability as well as upward mobility. And for me, my situation is very different now.
Thank you. So I hope we hold all of that in our minds, because we do know some things, some of the puzzle pieces, maybe not all, on what it takes. So next, and this is a question for each of you, I want to get right at one of the report's main findings, which is on economic mobility, particularly for low-income Boston residents. As you saw in Luke's presentation, based on the Opportunity Insights data, Boston has the second highest upward mobility for low-income people among the top 100 cities, tied with Minneapolis and second only to San Francisco, who is the top spot. However, on absolute terms, it's just clear that we shouldn't feel like we've won any contest here. In absolute terms, the household, second place means that the household income rise was to $35,000 from a base level in the analysis of around $27,000. And then, as Luke pointed out, the incredible opportunity I have when you disaggregate by race and gender, and with the available data, we find the range of disparate experiences from, on one end, low-income white men rising to earn $31,000, and at the low end, low-income black men rising to earn $24,000 in the city. So a lot of ways to unpack this, particularly to Paul's opening point. We want to do something about this. So what should we take away from these new findings about economic mobility in Boston?
Go ahead.
I'll try to start. And just, I mean, to both John and Luke, I think, and Stephen and Paul, to set this picture, I think it's important to, although there are gains, right, like that the gap is still so huge and hasn't moved significantly in that sense, right, over the decades of many smart people thinking about it. And as I think about it and reflect, sort of one nagging thought that I continue to have was, wow, but these folks are still making it, right? Like they're still somehow, in spite of those economic situations, that systemic oppression that is occurring, they're finding ways like to pay rent, right? Like that's, I don't know if I could do that with that income level in those communities. And so, you know, and true to the work that I am involved with, I'm asking, so what are we missing, right? And what is happening, how are people, and both in that social capital component of it and the way that people are investing and supporting one another to be able to overcome those challenges, but then also what are the gains that they're making that we're not paying attention to, and how can we drive investment towards those things so that they can also flourish. And then the second piece, which I sort of also think about is, right, like there is wealth going somewhere, right? It's just not going there. And how do we shift the conversation so that we can have that equality all the way down as far as investment to be able to give them the same opportunities as their white counterparts for the majority of the part, or just if you want to look from a class perspective. Because investment is happening. We are building assets inside of these communities. It's just not going to these populations. And I think that that's now that we know that and we can see it so stark, how do we begin to think about that?
I mean, I hear all the time Boston is doing well. We've got thousands of jobs here and things are great and people want to come to the city. But when I sit down with people in the neighborhoods, you mentioned the 68 blocks, one of the most frequent questions I got as I walked around that neighborhood was, can you get me a job? There are people that aren't feeling this boom, as the report shows. They're desperate for jobs. They're desperate for opportunities. They can't rent. They can't, they're being displaced. Someone was just telling me that in Grove Hall, where they can't even get a restaurant to open up there because folks just simply cannot afford to pay, you know, $9 for a glass of martini, like I like. But, but they can't do that. They can't think big in that way because people simply cannot afford to live there. But yet and still, just recently there was a condo that went up on a street there for $600,000. So yes, Boston is doing great. We see the numbers, but you know, I cover these communities, I cover these neighborhoods, and they're with them in their homes, and I'm listening to them, and that wealth is not trickling down. As you said, we've been talking about this forever. It seems like people are saying all the right things, but what is really happening, because so many people are being left behind.
Thanks, Janelle.
I think it's interesting that the data shows that we really need to analyze the cross-sectionality of race and wealth and whatnot. As Luke was sharing his story about his great-grandfather in World War II, I was thinking about my great-uncle Stanley, who served in World War II. He was going to get a GI Bill. He had access to a GI Bill, but he was a really great fried chicken maker. He worked as a cook in the back of a restaurant, even after an AA, because in his generation, because of race, he couldn't get those jobs, right? So his education for him was not mobility. And I'm just thinking for myself, and the structures and the policies that were in place to make things successful for myself, are they there for folks who are coming here now, right? If I'm immigrating here right at this moment, would I be able to access the opportunities? And for some, they can. I came here and stayed here because of the opportunities. For others, that might not be the case, even though this is an opportunity zone. And so when we're looking at equity and inequity, and this is a complex problem. And with complex problems, you need a high resolution in terms of not just the data, but the information. We need good information. big data, I don't care, sorry. What I care about is information that's useful, that leads us to good policy. And we've talked about this, and the panelists and the speakers earlier had talked about how we need a nuanced approach to things. And so when I'm looking at these reports, I unfortunately oftentimes feel that I give the analogies. I am but one data point, right? I am one data point to a missing data set currently in the sources in the report that has been very thoughtfully looked into. And so 10%, what this is saying is 10% of Boston's population is merely a footnote.
Well, I agree with you that information is extremely important. Here in Boston, there are plenty of opportunities within the public sector to change someone's trajectory, right? For instance, the Boston Fire Department. If you get a fire job, you are able eventually to make 6 figures. However, without that the crucial information that in order to get that job, you would need to first go into the military. You would first need to pass the civil service exam. You would need to be able to pass a physical exam. That information for years and years and years has been trickled down generationally in a certain segment of this city. And for a lot of people, particularly people of color, who are faithfully taking that test and not knowing that they ought to also go to the military, have never had that opportunity to get onto the fire department. And as a result, the fire department right now in Boston is the least diverse in the entire city. There needs to be political will at the state level to create various pathways, because that's an opportunity in the past where one could get a civil service job, where one could provide for their families, buy a home, move to West Roxbury, and be able to send their kids to college. That opportunity has been cut off almost entirely for a whole section of our city, and have prevented them from climbing into that middle class.
So I want to recognize that the part of the reason, and we're going to head now into action options, solutions, what can be done. But part of what I'm hearing here is that, and this can be both big data and the single data points together, but we really need to understand what's going on and have that information so that we can name and frame what truly is the problem. If it isn't even a problem, to your point, Jesus, people are making choices right now, and to design those solutions. So let's move a little bit into what can be done, and I want to start with Janelle, because one of the big themes in the report is obviously how expensive it is to live in the city, this region, and the importance of housing. I mean, we heard in your personal stories, many in this room, about having that foothold, having something that not only you can pass on, but something that really allows you that platform for mobility. So as Luke showed, just to refresh our memory, that household, a household would need to spend far more than 30% of median income, that affordability benchmark out there, to afford median rent in the vast majority of census tracts that John laid out in the map. And the particular calculation for that Dorchester census tract was that you needed to make nearly $100,000 to only pay 30% of income for rent. So in this light, even as we look at disparities across low-income residents by race and gender, any work to boost incomes seems to pale, and to bridge gaps seems to pale in comparison to the pressing need to moderate housing costs. So in your perch at the state level, I'd love to hear your perspective on what do you make of this data? What do you think are some of our best opportunities at this juncture to reduce housing costs?
So housing is both a stabilizing force, and as we've learned, it's a key to economic mobility. It's critical and it's foundational, but it's not sufficient to economic mobility. And we know that the housing crisis is really a regional one, right? But it requires local action. And what we're doing on the state level is encouraging good players and good best practices to really permeate through local government. One of the things that the governor has pushed is housing choice, right? To incentivize local communities to adopt ways in which they can increase housing production. We're not going to produce ourselves out of this affordability issue, but that's a component of getting us to having more opportunities throughout the different neighborhoods and cities and towns in the Commonwealth. There's some places like Boston. I was looking at the statistic that of 100 low-income families, they're able to serve 61 individuals. So 61% of that housing stock is produced in Boston. We need more than that, right? We have a goal as a state of 135,000 new units of housing by 2025. And last week, the Metro Mayors Coalition had announced their goal, right, to get together and figure out how do we produce more housing in our region. And when we say housing, I'm talking about homes. I'm talking about homes for folks who are the millennials, right, who everyone talks about and wants, but they don't have the capital or maybe the wealth to put down a down payment for that $500,000 home. We need them to be here for our economic health of Massachusetts. This is what we're talking about on a more macro level. We need homes for seniors who are aging in place. They're able to thrive and live with dignity in an accessible place. If folks can't downsize from larger homes that might have a second floor and move into smaller places and make those places available for those millennials. So that system's broken right now, and we need to figure out how do we revitalize the current stock as well as increase that stock. That's one of the ways that we're dealing with the housing crisis and trying to encourage more movement from the state level. Another point that I touched about briefly is that housing is not the end-all be-all, right? We have, I think Aviva Rothman-Shore is in the audience. We have an economic prosperity director at this moment, and looking at how do we look at, once housing is a foundation and you're stabilized, what are the other necessary services? What are the other necessary dosage of services, such as childcare, such as education, such as a well-paying job? What are the other things that we can cobble together to make sure that folks who are in opportunity zones can actually make it, right? So those are things that we're looking across secretariats to do and to bolster and to really support our residents.
That's great to hear. On this point of housing,
I mean, I would add to that, so that's exactly right. And putting this choice back in people's hands to be able to compete in this marketplace, I think is really critical. And again, like using my own personal story, but also from the data that we're learning directly from the families that we work with, they all have that dream, right, of being able to stabilize their housing, purchase a home on their own, but right, like what sort of wealth that they have to be able to amass and the savings that it takes to be able to get there is one obstacle. I think that then on top of that, the lending practices, right, of the private sector, it's really discriminate against these communities. So one thing is to obviously correct course on that area, but then the second is what are some of the alternatives that we are creating to be able to have folks like me benefit from pools of dollars that are directly, specifically to these communities to be able to flourish at their own choosing. It's one thing, and I think that the other piece too that is, and we are having this conversation also, I think transportation plays a huge role in that, right? And that people are, right, again, of what we're missing, that there are sort of there's this piecemealing that is happening inside of communities to be able to stabilize around sort of those infrastructure challenges. Again, how are we looking and investing in those pieces so that they can only do more of that? Because I think to your earlier point, right, like the big data is great, but the individual look at how people are, like this isn't tailor-made, right? Like how they adapt to their current situation to be able to address some of these challenges are just as critical to against those trends.
I just want to just to put a finer point on what you just said on lending practices. I quoting, I think, the mayor who said that banks are lending people of color. I think it's like 10% of the loans that go to people of color to afford housing is very low. And so there needs to be a lot of pressure from our lawmakers on these banks to be able to create opportunities for folks of color to get more loans so they can purchase more housing. That kind of pressure needs to, your foot cannot get off the gas on that one, because that is so imperative. And that's, as you said, very discriminatory. And another way in which folks of color can't own property and have assets. Let's not forget, in 2015, when that data came out that showed that the net wealth for white families is $250,000 compared to blacks at $8. That's because they don't have property. Right. And if they don't have property, they can't move out and go to the Cape and leave the home to their sons and daughters. And so much more needs to be done in terms of allowing or getting more people of color these home loans.
Yeah. I'd love to follow up on this point, Megan. Given all of the reporting and studying and observing you've done here from your perch, one of the other findings of the report was this hollowing out of the middle class. Right. So as we turn to what can be done, can you build on some of your points and think about, well, what can we do to boost the middle class in Boston, right, not just the focus on low-income residents, and especially in communities of color?
Right. Well, last year the Boston Globe did an amazing series on race in Boston, and the first story that they did, as they were looking at, I was not part of this series, by the way, fantastic series, but as they were looking at this particular question, one of the things the editors were asking was, where is the black middle class in Greater Boston? And one of the editors asked me that question. I actually didn't know. I could point them to a street here and there
Maybe John can help us with the exact class.
Throughout the city. But there was, unlike New York and Philly and New Orleans, there just isn't a black middle class in Boston. And so what the Globe did was they did a data analysis of census tract nationally to figure this question out. They looked at three things. You have to have 15% of the population needed to be black. Of that 15%, 30% needed to have a 4-year college degree. And they needed to make over $75,000 or whatever the median income was for that area. And guess how many census tracts in the area that they found? Anybody? Somebody said 2? 4. 2 in Stoughton, 1 in Milton, and 1 where I live in Hyde Park. So when we talk about the hollowing of the middle class, it is said in such a broad way, but for the black middle class, it's really hard hitting. Many of the people who are in the black middle class have themselves just gotten out of poverty. They might have just gotten their first home. They're trying to leave something for their kids, to kind of move the needle. But it is becoming increasingly clear that this hollowing out of the middle class is really affecting people who are people of color.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, we talk about this, there's been a number of census studies that show 75% of folks who are struggling in poverty today will move above the poverty line within 4 years, and 50% will fall back in within 5 years. And just to underline the fact that there is mobility, right? Like there is a building in that sense of momentum that is happening at all levels, lower levels of the income ladder, but we are not finding ways to be able to share in that wealth building, right? And again, sort of the point of driving investment back into their hands so that, right, you can create a little bit of a cushion for yourself and build and then think about, okay, great, what's next? Can I be able to purchase that car, buy that home, improve my credit in whichever way possible, because I'm no longer thinking about the paycheck to paycheck mentality that happens given the rent prices as well as so many other economic pressures inside of the household. And that part, like, we can't understate enough, right? Because there is huge mobility. It's not like these folks are stuck, right? Like that there isn't that opportunity there for people to be able to do, that are doing better for themselves. It's just that we're not paying attention to it.
Janelle, do you want to get in? Okay.
Go ahead.
Maybe this is a nice segue then, Jesus. I did want to tap on your unique experience. You both have your Boston experience and your national perspective. And we've had the pleasure here at the foundation to, over the years, know of FII's work and the very unique view, important view about poverty and families, and particularly using social capital in a different mindset and approach. Your website has a great line: 50 years of the war on poverty has made living in poverty more tolerable, but has not made it more escapable. And it really seems that FII has learned a great deal about what it takes for families to move out of poverty and stay out of poverty. So I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit more about FII's work and share what lessons really are relevant for our conversation today.
Sure. So we've been around since around 2001, and this is the brainchild of Mauricio Lynn Miller, our founder. It started out in Oakland, California, but Boston, with pride, we get to say we're the second site outside of California, or the first site outside of California, and been doing this work here for 9 years. Shout out to Jessica Tobner, who is our site director here, and doing the everyday work to carry our mission forward. And I think a couple of things that we have been able to learn in our work, and just quickly, we're partnering directly with these families. We're not a program or a service. What we know is that we understand is that people, as I mentioned, are doing this. We're just not paying attention and driving investment. So we lift the data directly from them, are not selling it to anybody, which is a common question, but then driving a small monetary investment back of an average of about $3,200 over 2 years to try to begin to reverse some of these trends, right? And having success to do so. We learned is that people are not only doing, but they're doing it together. That as much as I can share about the economic gains, we've been able to capture over $6 million in social capital exchanges that people are making through a 2-year engagement that they have with us. Now, what does that mean? That means is if I lose my child care voucher because I start doing too good, right? Both my husband and I start working. We're beginning to build that cushion to be able to get to buying that house, and then all of a sudden that voucher is pulled because I'm doing too good, right? But I'm not doing well enough to be able to support myself, that child care, as well as continue to build towards that future. And so that sets me back immediately. And that's a real life case where it was a group of other women who were meeting monthly and sharing with one another, who said, hey, go fight for that voucher so that you don't lose it, and while you do, we'll take care of your child. Now, that has a monetary value, and we asked them to be able to quantify that, and that's where those over $6 million in social capital exchanges are beginning to see. So just as important as those monetary gains are, right, and we see an average of over 22% increase of income in their 2-year engagement, it's the relationships, it's the people, the way that they're sharing in that social capital, sharing best practices, sharing examples of how to be able to purchase at home or gain better educational attainment for your child. That actually has a lasting effect well beyond whatever dollars that we can contribute inside of these communities. And so when we can step back, right, and we will, we're not meant to last forever, they continue to hold those relationships. And I think ultimately, right, and we talk a little bit about what the value of networks are. It's the way that I got my job right now, right? And I'm sure most of you, is the way either you got to your school or to your job, or thinking about your next opportunity in that way. When I went to purchase a home, I go to my friends. Like, they share with me how to be able to navigate a very complex system that I'm not familiar with, to keep me in being able to get myself in a position that is compromising, as well as just a litany legal questions that often come up. And so if that's the way that we function, obviously that's the way everybody functions. And how are we paying attention to that component of it as we think about these challenges? Because again, I mean, we all are great thinkers, right, and have great knowledge around these issues. Folks in these communities are living them every day, and as I've mentioned, are overcoming it every day. The next step is bringing them into the room and having them lead through how to be able to have them overcome these challenges themselves and investing in those solutions.
Yeah. Well, we commit to doing that because obviously, you know, while we thought we were going to solve all the problems today, I think we're going to just fall short. So this is only going to be the first in a series of actionable discussions. So what I want to do right now, we've gotten a wonderful table set by our two presenters, our panel, is to take a little bit of questions and answers, and that's not answers provided by both of our researchers. I want to get Luke and John in this game too. We have floating mics in addition to our panelists. So we have Kimberly and Caitlin with floating mics up there. Some ground rules. I think we all know what a question is. Question mark. I'm going to loosen it a little bit today from standard foundation guidelines that, you know, we really want to lift and elevate and build on the conversation. So if there is a comment, not an advertisement, that really adds to the conversation, a new perspective, something that you thought was missing that really needs to be raised, please do that. But whether it's a comment, additive comment, or a question, please keep it tight. Okay. What do we got? Why don't we start over here? Yeah.
The correlation between education and income is direct and has been that way for a long time.
Yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, the MCAS scores came out. They were not encouraging. Hundreds of high schools across the state. This is going to be a question.
Okay. And could you also please introduce yourself?
Gary Kaplan. I'm the executive director of JFY Networks, and I'm also an immigrant. I came here from Chicago. There has been little progress in educational indicators for years, for 5 or 10 years. The gaps between various groups in educational attainment have been inveterate. They haven't changed. Of all the social inputs that we have at our disposal, education is the cheapest. Wouldn't it make sense to, here comes the question, wouldn't it make sense to focus more on increasing, raising educational attainment, getting more people into and through post-secondary education, whether that means a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree or a 1-year technical certificate or whatever it might be. But would that not be a viable and actually attainable way of affecting some of these economic inequities?
Thank you.
That's a great question. And one I'm exploring this year for a series that will come out in December. But yes, I totally agree with you. But the problem is it's very complicated, and it's so big. I think it's taken people forever to sort of figure this out. In Boston, there's great inequities when it comes to our educational system. We have basically 3 exam schools that everybody wants to go to, and they're really, really terrific. We might have maybe 2 or 3 other high schools that are terrific, and the other 24 all up in the air. So our kids are being educated in a very uneven and one would say unequal, not equal way, I can't say the word. In addition to that, there's been a lot of efforts over the past decade or so to really focus on really smart and bright kids and get them through college, get them into college, support them through college, and get them to the finish line. But there have been a lot of gaps in that process as well. There was a point, I think we talked about Success Boston. It was an effort about a decade ago that 35% of the kids who graduated from BPS actually finished college. And they were able to, through intense coaching and advising, move that number up to about 52%, but it's been stuck there for the past, since 2007. So what's the solution there? Because you're right, without a college degree, you're stuck, barely making more than your parents. You're probably go back home living with your parents. You're not able to fully provide for yourself, let alone for your future. And so what's the solution? Colleges need to step up and do more. There needs to be much more efforts by nonprofits to really target smart kids, not just to get them into college, but make sure they finish. And not just when they're done, make sure they get into some sort of internship or training program that they can actually get a career. But it's a very complicated and long-term process. They're just now, I think, many of the colleges, private institutions, and public are beginning to very intentionally look at these issues and better ways that they can address lower income and first generation students who often go to college with a host of problems that aren't caught until they've left the system. But it is definitely one indicator to look at, and one way we can look at in terms of addressing how we can address this mobility issue.
I might just jump in with the prerogative. So this initiative that Megan just mentioned, Success Boston, it is ongoing. The foundation, in full disclosure, is a key partner and leader in that effort, which is a citywide effort.
Right.
And many of the issues that we've raised, we have looked at too. Proud of the gains of the system, but know there's a long way to go.
Right.
One of the things that's interesting, I think, about the question that was raised and just this view is that what will it take? Is it a silver bullet, a number of silver bullets? It's a mental model about finding the solution. And my own personal take is there's undoubtedly a huge effect, as John even laid out as key factors about high quality schools, having a BA, but it's not sufficient. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at it. We absolutely are trained on it here at the foundation. But what else also needs to be added to the mix while we continue to make progress on it? So, John, do you want to get in?
Yeah, I was just going to. Hello?
Yeah, great. So I think that it's important to distinguish between education as a goal or as a marker of success and education as the policy implement through which we achieve that goal. And I think that there's no question that raising high school graduation rates, raising educational achievement is a key marker that children are on better trajectories. My sense is that the data suggests that you want to think about that not just through direct educational policy, but through much broader lens. So just to give you an example, we didn't talk about this as much today, but some work that my colleagues have done have shown that there are basically two key determinants in which children go on to become inventors or can become involved in STEM fields, which obviously is very helpful for economic mobility. One is that they are kind of really good at math, so that's one thing, but then exposure to what you basically want to think of as mentors or just examples in the community of people doing this activity who look like them is also critical. Yeah. So for instance, there are many more women who go on to fields in STEM in areas where there are many female inventors. And the same is true for minority children as well. And so I think that's just one example of how even if your goal is just increasing the number of degrees in STEM that students achieve, you want to think beyond just what's going on in school. You want to think more generally about the system in which these children are being raised and are producing these trajectories.
I'm mindful of the time, and I can't help. I saw my boss raise his hand earlier, so I want to give him a prerogative of asking a question. And then I'm sorry to do this, but I do want to give our panelists an opportunity for closing comments. So rest assured, this is not the end of the conversation today.
Well, I'll be quick. I want to raise the issue of neighborhoods. So much of this seems to come down to, if you really want to solve this problem, get the child to a better neighborhood. And my question is, if you look at Boston, Boston was a full participant in the urban decline that began shortly after World War II, lost a third of its population, really in deep trouble. And with that, many, many neighborhoods were blighted and abandoned, weed-filled empty lots. But now, the blight in the city has been virtually eliminated. It's extraordinary, the physical condition that once devastated neighborhoods are now in. My question was for John Luke is, do we think that's made a difference? That it hasn't just been children moving to a better neighborhood, it's neighborhoods that weren't good getting much better.
I think it's a really interesting question, and I love the longer term perspective you have on those changes across neighborhoods, Paul.
I'm so old I can supply that.
Any of our panelists, you want to jump in?
I think Paul hit a keynote. We're not talking about just a few gifted kids and moving them to a better place. Let's talk about the place and making these places and these neighborhoods better so all kids aren't left behind. Right? You know, I understand there's a lot of attention to Raj Chetty's report. I don't think it's either or. And I worked in Chinatown, and that used to not be such a great place to live, right? But now there's a renaissance of the downtown where Chinatown essentially could be gobbled up by the downtown. It's actually advertised when you go on Redfin or whatnot as part of downtown. And when you're looking at the statistics in that neighborhood, you might see that it's just a low-income community because there's only, folks are making below poverty rate. But you know why it's that way? It's because folks 20, 30 years ago had the foresight to put in affordable housing, right? And those folks are benefiting from the renaissance of the downtown. Those low-income folks have a network of grandmas and friends and neighborhood groups that are bolstering them, right? And helping them move and helping them thrive in those communities, even though they are low income. So I think that's a great point that's part of my ending comment, to not just look at the individual, but how can we make all places better?
This is great. Janelle, thank you for the segue and the comment. What I'd like to do is actually now invite, it's perfect, the closing takeaway. Each of you is in a position to influence, as many in the room, the civic and policy conversation. So what's that one takeaway? We heard from you, Janelle. It's really to think about improving these places. This isn't just about the select few. Jesus, Megan, what are you taking away today?
Okay. It's hard to stick to just one thing.
Okay, maybe you get two.
Quickly on the neighborhoods, people are very connected to their neighborhoods. They don't want to move. In cases that are, stories that I've done in which there's been high crime and they've moved the family to somewhere else, they come back. They're so connected to that triple-decker, to that street, to the people next to them. So it's really difficult to say to somebody, we'll take your kids and move them somewhere else and maybe they can do better. So I do agree that the neighborhoods themselves need to also transform without also displacing people who live there. The other thing I want to point out is that the report we did not get to today dealt with the plight of black males. And that's a real issue that is affecting these families in these neighborhoods, in these communities. What do we need to look at in terms of getting more black males through high school, into college, into some sort of trade, into some sort of government positions? We really, as a community, as policy makers, as educators, need to be very, very intentional and very focused on this very, very vulnerable population. And so, do I get a third one?
Okay, I think two. Okay. Thanks, Megan.
Sorry.
You can take one of my two if you want.
I could go on and on.
Wait, you get two now too?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of like, and I'm glad, Stephen, that you mentioned that there's no silver bullet here.
Yeah.
And that, actually, and again, that we don't have to carry the burden on this, on our own, that communities will do it too. So many different thoughts. I think ultimately, the fact that we continuously are underestimating, undervaluing and punishing people for doing better in one side of the income ladder, while on the other side, we are rewarding, investing, pushing, and driving wealth building that is to the point that we're having this panel. I think to me speaks to what got us here to that point. It's not going to move us to where we want to head to. So how do we then begin to think about new policies that shift those trends so that we can begin to reconstruct that middle class that is so fleeing and shrinking quickly, not only in Boston, but across the country.
Well, thank you all. Can you please join me in thanking our panelists, our two presenters, John Freedman, Luke Schuster, for a wonderful discussion. So in brief closing, I'm taking my prerogative. I have three things, Megan. One thing is, it's actually something Luke said, which is, I think we have to remember that we're working from a place of strength. Income inequality could be up, mobility down, poverty persisting, but our economy is strong. So it was intentional, this framing. What does inclusive growth look like? What does shared prosperity look like? So that's one. The second really came from John, which is let's really understand the aggregate place effects. Place really matters. So it's a both and. We need people with BAs and a good education and all of that, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and where you grow up really matters. And then last, which is I hope more on a hopeful note, is that even if it's only 4 census tracts or certain neighborhoods in Boston, I think we have an opportunity to learn from what's working, learn from our own inner mobility experts, learn from what is working already in communities across the city and our Commonwealth. So let's use this opportunity to marry big data and lived experience and really look at that together. We have a lot that I think we can work on. For us at the Foundation, and particularly Boston Indicators, we're committed to continuing to set this table with great partners like Opportunity Insights, all of you in this room. And we want to place even greater emphasis, hopefully not on reports that just look like the one that you saw today, but what are those actionable solutions based in the data and lived experience that can really expand shared prosperity. So we're on a learning journey. We're on it with you. We're all on it in some ways, but maybe we need to connect up our learning journeys for us to really see a different result here in Boston. We want to hear your ideas. We're in the midst of thinking about subsequent convenings and forums on this topic with a more actionable bent, and you'll be getting a survey in just shortly after this forum. We'd love to hear from you, your feedback, your ideas. What's that next big conversation that we need to be having that leads to action? So in closing, I want to thank you again, everyone, for being here today, and I look forward to our work together.